So my name is Jeremy Opperman. I've been around for a while. Some of you may know my work or know me. So I'm self-employed. I have been so since 1999. I worked for the first 10 years of my career in sales and marketing in the consulting training arena. And then in 99, I grew tired of being retrenched. I was retrenched by that time for the third time. And I was sick and tired of it, and I started my own business. And in those days, it was just sales and marketing. I was selling consultants to corporates. I was the only man in the world who could get money out of a consultant. So the companies liked me because they didn't have to pay me, and the consultants liked me because consultants are historically bad at finding work for themselves. They're very good at doing the work, but they're not very good at marketing. And I was able to marry the two because I had a lot of networks. And so I did that for a short while, and the Employment Equity Act had just come out. And it changed the whole game for us as persons with disabilities. For those of you who don't know, I'm also blind. I have RP, and it's descended very fast in my 50s, and I'm now essentially blind. I simply have light and dark. Now, so the Employment Equity came out in 1998. Following the Constitution, which was promulgated in 96. Now, I mention these because they're important, because in 96 the Constitution recognized disability. It was one of only 4 constitutions in the world that recognized disability. So that was something, and we thought, yeah, we're on to something. Then in 98 the Employment Equity Act came out, and I'll never forget that promulgation, because it sent a shudder through the disabled community of opportunity and enthusiasm, of potential. And that's great. And so I found my clients suddenly saying, well, do you know anything about disability equity? Do you know anything about diversity? And so I had to pivot quite fast. And before I knew it, I became my own consultant. So I was marketing and selling and beginning to do the work. And so I started training the Code of Practice on the Employment of Persons with Disabilities, which came out a year or two after the Employment Equity Act. And so what I very quickly realized was that companies honestly thought that the way that they could honor the Employment Equity Act and comply was to simply find people with disabilities. In those days, and I'm talking the very early 2000s now, a lot of people tried the recruitment agent route for persons with disabilities, thinking it would be simple. And I watched this with interest, and I confess I even got involved for a while, thinking maybe there was an angle here. But I withdrew quite fast because I made a discovery, I think, that you can't sow seed in unfertile ground. And if the companies aren't prepared for the integration of persons with disabilities, they're never going to recruit easily. And they're always going to have a problem. And so I didn't get involved too deeply in the employment part of the game, but I started working in what I call disability integration preparation. And so I focused my business on working with corporates too, and when I say corporates, I actually mean employers, but obviously government as well, to focus more on the preparation side, to prepare their environments physically if necessarily. I got very involved in accessibility, but attitudinally primarily, because I put it to you that there's no such thing as a physical barrier or an inaccessible barrier on its own, for the simple reason that they didn't make itself. It didn't make itself. They're made by people. And whether that's physical inaccessibility and an unnecessary flight of stairs, or digital accessibility, they're made by people. And surely, if we can do something about, and that's an attitudinal barrier, and if we can do something about that attitude, then we're in business, because then we can start moving and removing barriers. Because if you can identify them, you can usually make a plan to remove them. And so for the next 23 years, I focused entirely on disability integration preparation. I developed became quite a prolific disability awareness program called Meeting Disability. I created a disability equity strategic approach called Eating Elephants. You know the old joke, can you eat an elephant? Now the thing about corporates, you see, is that they look at disability equity with horror because they have no clue about what to do really. And they stare at this challenge and they think, oh my God, how are we going to do this? I don't know what to do. When do we start? And I break it down into chunks because you know the old joke, you can eat an elephant one bite at a time. And so I've developed this approach, which has been quite useful to many employers or corporates. But here's our big challenge, is that in the country, is that we're looking at the issue of disability empowerment through a very narrow lens. And I'm not talking about us as in the room here. I am talking once again about employers and corporates particularly. Is that we have at the moment quite an hysteria around compliance. We're in a compliance zoo at the moment. You've got to comply with Papaya, you've got to comply with BEE, you've got to comply with employment equity, you've got to comply with everything. And there's a real compliance fatigue out there. Corporates are, to use a South African colloquialism, gatvol, actually, of endless compliance. You can barely urinate without having to proof of address. I hate that question. Can I have your proof of address, please? You know, honestly. And so, now here's the problem. The only piece of legislation in this country that explicitly supports disability is the Employment Equity Act, because we simply don't have an overarching piece of legislation yet. And because of that, all energy in the country around disability empowerment has been around employment, because it's the Employment Equity Act. And the problem with that is we don't only work. We actually do have lives. There isn't a single person in this room that would be in this room without education. The Employment Equity Act has no jurisdiction about your education, about your transport, about your housing, about digital accessibility, none whatsoever. And until such time that we have a overarching disability rights legislation in this country, and Albert, you'll remember I said this nearly 20 years ago, I said this at the biannual, is that we are in crying need of a disability rights legislation. Because if all the energy is focusing only on employment, no one's paying attention to the other stuff. And because disability is largely invisible, we are always going to be forgotten. So I want to tell you a little bit about the employment cycle. Now, typically, in the last 23 years, I've done a lot of work specifically around pan-disability. I felt it important to include pan-disability, meaning other disabilities, rather than fixating and focusing only on the blind. So this is quite a departure for me, to focus on blind issues only. And forgive me if I deviate back into pan-disability language from now and then, because I think it's important that we mustn't isolate ourselves. We are a bigger family, and we're much stronger when we behave like a bigger family. We're already weak because we are divisive. You know, the deaf and the blind don't see eye to eye, for a start. and so we need to actually learn to work together more. But it's important also that we look at issues around visual impairment. And so one of the things that I did during my career was to create a couple of products. And one of them was a survey that I ran with clients, which was to interview, in a structured interview, the employees of disabilities to ascertain their aspiration. And many of those employees were blind. Now, to be quite honest, historically, we need to own something as blind people, is that if we compare ourselves with the other elements of disability, particularly the deaf, mental disabilities or psychosocial disabilities, physical disabilities, we've actually been fairly well employed for the last 100 years or so, because of the telephone, Many of us in this room began our careers on the phone, including me, straight out of varsity. That's the only job I could find. And so I'm not saying it's been easy, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but the fact is that we have had quite a lot of employment opportunities as a community, all right? So we just need to own that. But let's talk a little bit about the issues at hand. So let's go back to what I was talking about this compliance thing. Because the country is fixated on compliance, and the Employment Equity Act is the only legislation supporting disability, what needs to happen is you need to click lenses, if you like. I call this a trianocular view, and stop looking only at compliance and look at the human rights issue. And I'm not talking at corporates here or employers, and I realize that in the room we're not necessarily only those people, and not enough possibly. But it's still an important lesson. So we need to look at the realities of disability in the country. What is going on there? What is the transport reality? What is the education reality? Then we need to click lenses one more time. And I call this the business case. The business case is we need to be aware that we are consumers as well. Once again, I'm thinking pan-disability here. Now, corporates and employers and businesses very rarely take disability into account when they're considering their consumers, their customers. And I'll remind some of you are possibly too young, but I'll remind some of you who will definitely remember this. The classic business case was, do you remember the days when we used to have to buy talks to put on our phone, and we had to pay for it, remember? And remember then when you went to go and you said to the vendor, can we put it on the next phone? No, you've got to buy it all over again. And we said, what the hell? And then Vodacom said, guess what? Talks is for free for blind customers. And what did we all do? I know I did. If you look at my cell number is 083. And yet I'm with Vodacom. Why? Because I'm migrated, like so many of you. But here's the real business case. I didn't just have one phone. I held the account for my entire family. It was my wife's phone, my son's phone, my daughter's phone, my dongle, and my phone. 5 accounts I moved across. That's the business case. And so we need to be aware of it, that we are consumers. Now, having said that, it's about employment issues and what I was promised, I said I would talk about. So the first thing I want to talk about is companies need to look at equity in a holistic way rather than fixate entirely on a very narrow employment cycle issue. The problem with employers is that they very often throw this diversity/equity baby at HR only. And HR's got to catch this thing. And then they do what they can. The trouble is that they very often don't get the respect that they ought to from the other line entities, the other line managers in the business. So if a corporate is serious about employment equity, what they should be doing is making sure that all elements of their business are disability confident. Now, if you break a business up into its elements, you've got issues like operations, you've got facilities, you've got IT, you've got sales and marketing, you've got your administration, you've got your finance, of course you've got your HR. Now, if every one of those things are more disability confident, it'll make the employment of persons with disabilities far easier. So, for instance, if your IT infrastructure is not disability confident, it means you're probably almost certainly going to have an inaccessible digital platform, like an intranet or some sort of an app that they use within the organization. And as many government departments have discovered, when you have an e-recruitment platform and it's inaccessible, you're not going to attract the blind to apply for jobs. If your physical infrastructure is not accessible, you're going to not find it very easy to hire persons with physical disabilities. If your finance department is not disability confident, when it comes time to talk about reasonable accommodation, and the finance department starts creating unnecessary obstacles in the way, then that's going to make it harder to employ persons with disabilities. If your sales and marketing in the organization aren't savvy or aren't confident about disability and understand that people with disabilities are customers too, then you're not going to necessarily attract people with disabilities. I've always said to the banks, in fact, the city councils are a better example. The city council used to complain bitterly in the early 2000s about not finding people with disabilities. And I would say to them, well, if you don't look after your citizens with disabilities, why on earth would they want to work for you? And so we need, organizations need to pay attention in a more holistic way if they wish to achieve anything here. So now I'm going to quickly run you through. Now, typically I would have done a PowerPoint, and I figured that what's the point when most of us couldn't see it anyway. So for anybody with vision, I'm going to pretend there's a PowerPoint up, and you can pretend, you can imagine the slide I'm going to show. So the first slide is actually a person. I use the wheelchair a lot in my cartoons. I don't draw them, I imagine them, and then I hire a cartoonist to create them. And so there's a picture of a guy in a wheelchair, and it's just used as an analogy. And there's plenty of stairs all around, and he's looking up at a window, and there's a woman peering out of the window, and he's saying to her, I'm here to apply for the job. And she looks at him and she says, oh, I'm terribly sorry, the job's taken. So I thought I'd tell you a little story. I like anecdotes. So I've got a blind friend, and he's very, very well employed. I suspect he's probably one of the best employed blind people in this country. And senior. And he was looking around, as one does, at what other jobs there are. And he saw a job that he really thought might be a good fit. So he sends his CV through. Bring, literally 30 seconds after he hits send, there's a call from the agent. And she says, oh, let's call him Keith. She says, oh, Keith, I can't believe it. What a wonderful CV. This is amazing. I can't wait to introduce you to the principals. You're going to make such an amazing addition to the team. And then he said to her, and he said, I really want to meet you. When can we meet? And he said, oh, I'd love to meet you. Tracy, thank you very much. I'd love to meet you. And then he said something, and I said to him later, what the hell possessed you to say it? He said, oh, I just need to tell you that I'm blind. And she said, oh, right. Okay, right, Keith, I tell you what, I'm going to have to just go talk to my principals. I'll get back to you. What do you think? Think she did? No. So he did. He phoned her and said, next day, he said, Tracy, I'm a little confused. Yesterday you were all over me. And she said, oh, Keith, I'm terribly sorry. I made an awful mistake. The job's been taken. Now, what do you think? What's the likelihood that that's true?
She probably didn't even tell them and look.
Precisely. Now, what that illustrates is this tendency to stereotype and to assume. And now it's interesting because when Keith began his employment at that organization, and I have to say I had something to do with it, not so much as an agent, but as a supporter of the HR person, literally 22 years ago now. I remember when, and he's got a hell of a good CV, and I remember when Keith went for the job, and the HR lady is called Sarah, and I want to tell you, before I tell you that story, remember that, I'm going to go back to that, because here's an interesting, I want to tell you a little bit about what HR people aren't doing, possibly, is that level of assumption and that level of stereotyping is because they're not actually applying the rules. And here's a lesson in this. It's called competency-based recruitment, and it's the way we should be recruited. So I'm going to tell you another story before I go back to Keith's story. But remind me, okay? So I've got lots of stories, as you can tell. So here we go. So there's a man, well-known man, many of you will know him, and he applied for a job a long time ago. This is a good 26, 7 years ago. He applied for a job, and he had a law degree, and the job was for a legal officer. And he applied, and he wasn't shortlisted, and he queried. It was a state-run entity, and so he had the right to say, oh, excuse me, why am I not shortlisted? And they said, no, because it clearly says there, an inherent requirement of the job is a valid driver's license. And this man said, really? Okay, now are you looking for a lawyer or are you looking for a driver? So here's the thing, and this is the big mistake, is we need to understand the difference between an inherent requirement of the job and the performance of the essential functions of the job. They are two entirely different things. And so here's what should have happened. So what should have happened when our friend applied for that job? They should have established what is the inherent requirement of a job as a legal officer. It's clearly a law degree, LLB, maybe B.Proc, okay, but LLB definitely. And if you're looking for an accountant, it'll be a B.Com. If you're looking for an engineer, it's a BSc engineering, right? Now, if the individual doesn't have that thing, then throw his CV in the dustbin, because then he shouldn't be applying for the job. But you don't need to assess the disability at that point. It's got nothing to do with you. All you're doing at that stage is assessing, does the candidate have the inherent requirements of the job? BCom, engineering, in this case law, whatever it is. Only then, when you've established that and you've created a shorter list, then you need to start establishing them. This is when they should have approached him. He should have absolutely been, because he's a brown man, he's got equity from a race and a disability point of view, and they absolutely should have said, they should have shortlisted him. Then they should have said, right, do you know that there are 17 hospitals that you need to go around? And how do you propose you're going to visit them? In which case he could have said, well, I have a car and a driver. But they never gave him that opportunity. Or he could have said, I could use a GG and you could find me a driver. Or he could have said, I'll bum a ride with somebody else in a GG. Or he could have said, well, they should have asked him, and he could have said, I'll catch public transport. But he wasn't given the opportunity. So he was bounced before. And so the essential functions of the job, that's where you start applying the issue around, and that's where reasonable accommodation comes in. You only figure a reasonable accommodation. You don't do it in inherent requirement of the job time, only the essential function time. And so this is why so many people with disabilities are bounced sooner than they should be. So let me tell you that second story about Keith. So when Keith started at the company he's still with at the moment, he applied for the job. Sarah, the HR lady, took one look at this and realized this guy is sharp. He's got a couple of degrees, he's got an MBA, he's very bright, and he's eminently, in fact, possibly overqualified for what he originally went in for. And she was quite happy to put him at the top of the pile. So the accolade here goes to Sarah, because she applied inherent requirement of the job, yes. Can he perform the essential functions of the job? So she went to him and said, right, Keith, I'm going to shortlist you here, and I'm really interested in how you're going to do the job we expect you to do. In which case he demonstrated on his computer, using JAWS, and whatever techniques he needed to do, he could do, because he's done similar work before. She was convinced. Now here's where it gets interesting, because she then went to the line manager. He says, do you have a short list? Yes, she says. Good. Tell me about some of them. Well, I've got this guy. He's head and shoulders above the rest. Oh, yeah, that sounds good. Yep, he's got this degree, that degree, and he's this experience. Wow, he sounds amazing. And I need to tell you that he's blind. And the line manager went, what? Sarah, are you smoking your socks? He said. What do you mean he's blind? How's he supposed to do this job? Do you realize how much, you've got to be on the screen all the time? Blah, blah, blah. He's blind. And she said, I've established that he has the inherent requirements of the job. And I've ascertained that he can perform the essential functions of the job. Trust me, he can do this job. But he's blind. How on earth is he going to do this? And this went on for days. Sarah saying, and to her credit, she stuck to her guns. And she said, I'm telling you, this man is the best candidate. And this guy, yes, but he's blind. How's he? And it went on and on. Eventually, she wore him down. And he said, all right, what the hell? You know what? Okay. You know what? I'm gonna try, but don't complain if it doesn't work. You know that thing? Now, here's the great part of the story. That was 22 years ago. Keith is now about 3 levels above that line manager. And he's the head of that department. Isn't that cool? And his name isn't Keith. But that's the point, is that if we apply the rules, and then the next thing I'll talk about is reasonable accommodation. And so I want to tell you another story. So there's a teacher out there, and in my career, while I was a consultant, I was asked by the Premier if I could create the disability desk for the province. And so I did. And in 2015, I created a disability desk, and I ran the disability desk, which was a wonderful experience for me. And I was able to do quite a lot. And while I was working there, across my desk came this query from a teacher. I'm losing my vision. I'm the principal of a little school in Cape Town, and they put me on long leave. They've sent me to Athlone School for the Blind because they think I need to learn how to be blind. They have no idea what to do with me. And I met him immediately, and I ascertained what was going on with his vision loss and another complication, but the vision loss was the primary thing. And indeed, they had immediately suspended his appointment and put him on long leave while they worked out what to do. Now, my vision has deteriorated over the last 50 odd years, and I remember that trajectory. I used Zoom text for 20 years before I had to give it up and go over to a screen reader. So I know what it's like to lose your vision. And so I said to him, and I tested him, and we established that a CCTV, a magnifier, a desktop magnifier, would have been absolutely perfect for him, and Zoom text on the computer. Now, it took me 1 year and 2 months to try and convince the department that this guy, that's all he needed. And that's literally all he needed. But they put him through hell in 1 year, where they put him through assessments. I'll never forget the assessment. They went to ICAS. ICAS is the big outsourced agency many of you have heard of. And they sent an OT who had hardly ever seen a blind person in her life, and they made him climb up and down stairs, and they made him grip stuff, and they made him sit up and off a chair, and she had no clue about the blind issue. And they sent this ridiculous report. And it took an incredible amount of time. It literally took 3 months for that cycle alone, the assessment, etc. And I kept saying, he needs a magnifier, and he needs Zoom text. He needs a magnifier, and he needs Zoom. And I kept talking. I sounded like a parrot. I kept repeating this. This is all this man needs, and he will be able to do the job. And eventually, at the end, it was, can you imagine? There's a dignity issue of being suspended. There's the trauma, and this is something we don't take into account enough, is the trauma of vision loss during your employment cycle, during your time as an employee. Now, I know about this because I've had that trajectory of vision loss over a long time, and we don't pay enough attention to it, to the trauma that it really is. It's traumatic for the employee, and it's actually quite traumatic for the employer if they care. But the bottom line is that they eventually succumbed, and it was largely due to the resignation of 2 people. They've got things called district managers. And these 2 district managers were absolutely convinced that a partially sighted man could not be a teacher, let alone a principal. They had never come across the idea of reasonable accommodation, and they didn't engage enough to be able to ascertain whether it would work or not. And they just simply said, can't be done, can't be done, can't be done. And the moment they resigned, we were able to apply what we needed to. And the moment we applied what we needed to, he went back and became a principal. The new district manager loved him. She realized that he was very efficient. While he was away, by the way, he carried on studying. And he did an entire master's in that short time, or completed his master's, to be honest. And he must be doing something right, because 2 years ago, right in the middle of COVID, he got promoted. And he's now the headmaster of Vista Nova, a larger school for disability. So isn't that a great story? If that doesn't deserve a hand of applause, nothing does. Now, the lesson in that was reasonable accommodation, and particularly the lack of information, the lack of information about, and I shall stop sooner than you did, and the lack of information that the corporates have around, the employers have around the issue of things like reasonable accommodation. So if we are going to work for the empowerment and the employment of persons with disabilities, we need to be sure that we are, there's a lovely term in diversity, equity and inclusion. It's the hottest thing in the world these days. Everybody's a DEI consultant now. And it makes me smile because people like me have been doing this for ages and ages. Now all of a sudden it's hot property. That the big issue around DEI is called alliedship. Alliedship. So it comes from the word allied, which means friend. And we need to apply greater alliedship. And so that we can help. And we need to speak as one voice. And we need to talk things like inherent requirements versus essential functions. And we need to stand up and speak our truth. And speak our truth when we encounter discrimination and prejudice. Thank you very much.